Hello my lovelies, and welcome to my little corner of the internet, where shadows whisper and the eerie comes to life. I'm Granny Shivers, here to share spine-chilling tales of horror, the ghostly supernatural, and the unexplained. Tonight's tale takes us deep into the wilderness of the South Island of New Zealand, where a group of friends set out on a camping trip, only to find themselves in a battle for survival. As they face the terrifying choice of whether to fight or run, their lives are changed forever. Will they escape the killer's grasp, or will they fall prey to something far worse? If you enjoy stories that send shivers down your spine, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a haunting moment. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and let's begin tonight's tale, shall we? Trapped in the killer's playground, camping with my mates. The air smelt sweet, clean, clear and sunny, just how I like it. I was excited about our upcoming camping trip a couple of hours inland to the foothills of the South Island, New Zealand. We were heading off on what I was sure would be the most epic camping trip ever. My heart was particularly bursting with excitement. Here I was, surrounded by three incredible guys. Jared, my sweet, devoted butcher boyfriend, with a smile that could melt butter, which is perfect because butter is my thing. Jake, all rugged and buildery, with a don't mess with me vibe. And Lee, our calm, history-loving librarian, who probably has a fact for every tree we pass. And then there's me, JJ, 22, baker, drama queen, and, if I do say so myself, the glue that holds this little group together. The drive was long, but my playlist, a mix of headbangers and guilty pleasures, kept us hyped. Well, mostly me. Jared hummed along like the sweetheart he is. Jake grunted something about real music, and Lee just smirked, nose already buried in a book about the South Island's pioneer history. Typical. When we finally reached the inland turnoff, the landscape unfolded like a scene before us, straight out of one of those wilderness movies. Towering trees loomed over us, their leaves rustling like they were whispering secrets that I wasn't cool enough to understand. The golden hour sun spilled through the branches, casting shadows that seemed to stretch forever. It was equal parts breathtaking and a little creepy. Naturally, I loved it. "This is going to be amazing," I declared, spinning around to take it all in. Jared gave me that affectionate grin of his, the one that said he'll follow me anywhere, even if it meant dealing with my endless theatrics. Jake rolled his eyes but smirked. Lee muttered something about ancient Maori legends tied to the area, which, honestly, only made me more excited. Parking in the allocated spot, we collected all our gear and started our hike deep into the forest, each step pulling us further away from civilization. By the time we reached our secluded clearing, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky all colours. The guys set up camp. Jake and Jared wrestled with the tent poles while I provided emotional support, and Lee wandered off to examine some old carvings on a nearby tree. Once the fire was crackling, we all settled in. The warmth of the flames painted our faces in flickering light, and I couldn't resist taking the spotlight. "So here we are," I began dramatically, waving at the surrounding trees. "Just four adventurers, braving the wilds. Who knows what mysteries lie in wait?" "Probably just possums," Jake said dryly, but his lips twitched like he was holding back a laugh. "Or the ghost of some settlers who met a tragic end," Lee chimed in, not looking up from his book. He had a knack for saying the creepiest things in the calmest voice. Jared passed me a skewer of marshmallows he'd toasted to perfection, and I couldn't help but sigh. "You're too good to me," I said, leaning against him. He chuckled and kissed my forehead, and for a moment everything felt perfect. That was, of course, until a howl, low, haunting and distant. It cut through the night like a knife, sending shivers down my spine. The group fell silent, all eyes on the dark forest beyond the firelight. "What the hell was that?" Jared whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Probably just the wind," Jack offered, but his tone was less than sure. "Or a wolf," I suggested, fully leaning into the drama. "A big, scary, man-eating wolf." "There are no wolves in New Zealand," Lee said, ever the historian. Still his eyes flickered towards the trees, betraying a hint of unease. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every rustle of the leaves and every snap of a twig seemed to amplify in the darkness. My dreams were a chaotic mix of ancient forests, shadowy figures, and weirdly a massive flaming cake. When I finally woke, the fire had burned low and the guys were huddled around it, their faces drawn and serious. "Morning, sunshine," Jake said when he noticed me stirring. "You missed all the fun." "What fun?" I demanded, sitting up and brushing the leaves from my hair. Jared's hand found mine, his usually steady grip trembling ever so slightly. "There was something out there," he said, glancing towards the woods. "We heard it again, closer this time." Lee nodded, his calm facade cracking just enough to show he was rattled. "Whatever it was, it's just not the wind." The sun was rising, its golden light spilling over the treetops, but it did little to chase away the lingering tension. I stood, brushed off my pants and forced a grin. "Well, boys, it looks like this trip just got interesting." Deep down, though, a small knot of dread was beginning to form, because as much as I loved a good adventure, this felt different. The wilderness wasn't just calling us, it was warning us. The hollow trail. The morning air was heavy, the kind that sticks to your skin even before you've started moving. I sipped at the coffee Jake handed me, but it didn't do much to shake off the tension from last night. "So what's the plan?" I asked, my attempt at casual coming out a little too forced. "I mean, we're not just letting a spooky noise ruin our itinerary, are we? Right?" Jake, ever the practical one, shrugged. "There's a trail nearby that leads to some thermal hot pools. It's a good hike and should take our minds off whatever that was." "Hot pools? Yes, please," I declared, trying to inject some life into the moment. "Relaxation therapy, here we come." Jared smiled faintly, but still looked uneasy. He kept glancing towards the forest like he was expecting something to step out at every moment. "Think of it this way," Lee said, his librarian voice full of logic. "If there was something out there, it wouldn't want to hang around in the daylight." "Right? Because that's how monsters work," I chirped, earning a weak laugh from Jared. We packed light for the hike, bringing just enough food, water and first aid supplies for the day. The trail started easily enough, winding through the lush undergrowth with occasional breaks where sunlight poured through the canopy. "Is it just me, or does this place feel quieter than it should?" I asked after a while, breaking the silence that had settled over us. Jake glanced back at me. "Quieter how?" "I don't know, the birds. No wind, no nothing. It's like the forest is holding its breath." Jared squeezed my hand reassuringly, though his grip was still a little shaky. "Maybe we're just imagining it. Last night freaked us out." But Lee stopped walking and turned his head, listening. "No," he said softly. "JJ's right. It's too quiet." We all stood there, straining our ears. Nothing. No rustling leaves, no distant chirps, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. "Well," Jake said, breaking the spell, "the pools aren't going to find themselves." We kept moving, the sulphur smell growing stronger as we went. After about an hour we reached the clearing. The hot pools were breathtaking, and for a moment I forgot all about the eerie silence of the forest. The water was crystal clear, swirling with shades of green and blue, and the rising stream caught the sunlight like something out of a fantasy film. "This," I said, planting my hands on my hips, "is what I'm talking about. Adventure, beauty, the works." Kicking off my boots, I wriggled out of my clothes to the bikini I was wearing underneath. "I don't care how much the pool smells like rotten eggs. I'm getting in." "You're supposed to ease in," Liz said. "Too late," I called over my shoulder. "Oh, it's hot." I winced as the heat hit me and swam over to a protruding rock. Jared grinned, tugging off his shirt to follow me in. "If she burns her ass off, I'm not carrying her back to camp." Jake rolled his eyes, but started peeling off his layers too. "Let's just hope this isn't scalding enough to cook us." Lee hesitated, looking at the water like it might bite him. "I'll just watch, for now." "Suit yourself, Grandpa," I teased, splashing water in his direction. The guys waded in, the warmth sinking into our muscles, chasing away the lingering chill of the morning. I let out a long, dramatic sigh as I slipped back down into the water and leaned against the smooth rock. "If I could bottle this feeling, I'd be a millionaire," I chirped. "You also have to bottle the smell," Jake pointed out. "Details," I said, waving him off. Jared floated closer, his face softening as he watched me. "You look happy." "Why wouldn't I be?" I said, throwing my arms wide. "I'm in the middle of nowhere with my favourite people in a magical tub. This is peak life." For a little while it felt like everything was perfect. We laughed, splashed, and traded jokes, the tension from the night before fading into the background. Eventually Lee dipped his feet in, though he stayed perched on the edge like he was ready to bolt at any second. It wasn't until we all climbed out and were drying off that Lee spotted something unusual. He was wandering near the edge of the clearing, his sharp eyes catching on something half buried in the dirt. "Hey," he called, crouching down. "Come look at this." Jared and I exchanged a glance before heading over. Jake followed, running a towel through his damp hair. "What is it?" I asked, watching as Lee brushed away the leaves and dirt to reveal a small rusted locket. "Random jewellery in the middle of nowhere," Jared muttered. "It's not creepy at all." Lee opened it carefully, revealing a faded photograph inside. The image was of a young woman with soft curls, her expression hauntingly solemn. "Okay, it's officially weird," Jake said, leaning in to get a better look. "And there's more," Lee added, his voice tinged with an unease. He reached into a crevice between two rocks and pulled out a bundle wrapped in decaying cloth. "Why do I feel like you shouldn't open that?" I blurted, my nerves prickling. Lee paused briefly before revealing the bundle. Inside lay a rough wooden doll with wide staring eyes and a twisted grin stitched onto its face. The doll wore painted clothes and it appeared ragged, adorned with crude cuts that dripped red paint, resembling fresh wounds. A chill ran down my spine despite the lingering heat from the pools. "That's disturbing." "It could be a ritual object," Lee said, his fascination outweighing his discomfort. "Or maybe it was meant to scare people away." "Well, it's working," I muttered, glancing over my shoulder at the shadowy tree line. Jake turned the doll over in his hands, his brow furrowed. "This wasn't just left here randomly. Someone put it here on purpose." "And now you're messing with it?" I said, crossing my arms. "Great plan." Lee wrapped the doll and locket back up and placed them where he'd found them, but the unease didn't lift. The forest, which had seemed so beautiful earlier, now felt stifling and watchful, like it was holding its breath. We packed up and started the hike back, but the light seemed dimmer somehow, the trail more menacing. None of us spoke much, and for the first time since we'd set out on this trip, I didn't feel like the fearless, fun-loving JJ. I felt like we were being watched. Shadows in the woods. The walk back from the hot pools felt heavier than the hike out, like the forest was closing in on us. The air was thick and still, and even the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the trail seemed muffled. Jared stayed closer to me, his hand brushing mine every so often, as if to reassure himself I was still there. Jake broke the silence first. "So we're all feeling this, right? It's not just me?" "Nope, it's not just you," I said, my voice a little sharper than I meant it to be. I tugged my jacket tighter around me, even though the air wasn't cold. "This place gives me the creeps." Lee, ever the logical one, tried to reassure us. "It's just our imaginations. We're unsettled by what we found, and now we're projecting that unease onto the environment." Jake shot him a look. "You're telling me the doll wasn't creepy as hell?" "It was," Lee admitted, glancing over his shoulder, "but creepy doesn't mean dangerous." "Tell that to every horror movie ever made," I muttered. The trail twisted and turned, the trees casting long shadows across our path. The golden light from earlier had faded, replaced by an overcast gloom that made the forest feel oppressive. Halfway back we came across a tree marked with deep gashes, as if something with claws had tried to tear it apart. "What the hell made that?" Jared asked, his voice low. Jake crouched to examine the marks. "It's probably just a wild animal. A bear or... Wait, we don't even have bears here." "No bears in New Zealand," Lee said, his tone matter of fact. "Great. So what does that leave? A big cat? A really angry bird?" I said, trying to keep the mood light, but my voice wavered. Jared grabbed my arm. "Let's just keep moving, okay?" We picked up the pace, the tension between us growing with every step. The forest felt alive. Not with birds or rustling leaves, but with something unseen, something watching. By the time we made it back to camp, the fire was cold and the shadows were longer than they should have been for that time of the day. Jake and Jared got to work rekindling the flames while Lee disappeared into his tent, muttering about organising his notes. I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the forest. Every instinct I had screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. "JJ," Jared's voice pulled me back. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." The fire crackled to life, and we all gathered around it. The warmth and light a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. Jake was first to break the silence. "We need to talk about what we found. The locket, the doll, it's not normal. Someone left those there for a reason." "Maybe it's just an old ritual," Lee offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "A superstitious thing, to ward off bad spirits." "Or to invite them in," Jake countered, his eyes on the flames. "Okay, can we not?" I said, throwing a stick into the fire with more force than was necessary. "We're here to camp, not a star in a horror movie." Jared put his arms around me. "JJ's right. We'll be fine. We'll stick together, and if anything weird happens, we leave. Simple as that." Lee looked unconvinced, but he nodded. "Agreed. No point in overthinking it." The forest didn't seem to agree. Later that night we sat around the fire. Something moved at the edge of the clearing. It was subtle, a shift of the shadows, a barely audible rustle, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, leaning towards Jared. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Stay here." Jake and Lee noticed too, both of them tensing as Jared grabbed a torch and stood. "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "Don't go alone." Jake stood as well, grabbing a sturdy branch from the pile of firewood. "I'll go with him." The two of them ventured towards the edge of the clearing, the beam of the torch slicing through the dark. I held my breath, every nerve in my body on high alert. "See anything?" Lee called softly from beside me. Jared shook his head. "Probably just an animal." But when they came back, the unease hadn't lifted. Jared sat close to me, his hand gripping mine like a lifeline. "I don't like this," I said quietly. "Me neither," Jared admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The fire crackled and popped, but it wasn't enough to drown out the feelings that we weren't alone. The forest watched, waiting, and deep down I knew this was only the beginning. A stranger in the woods. The morning light filtered through the canopy, but it brought no warmth. The forest was still, unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "We need more firewood," Jake announced, breaking the uneasy silence over breakfast. He was already rolling his shoulders like he couldn't wait to stretch his legs. "I'll come with you," Jared offered, brushing crumbs off his hands. "Stay close," Lee said, glancing towards the trees, "and shout if you see anything weird." "Define weird," Jake said with a smirk, but his eyes darted to the edge of the clearing. Jared grabbed his axe and the two of them disappeared into the woods, their voices fading with the crunch of leaves and twigs. Jake and Jared worked in silence for the first stretch, the rhythmic thud of the axe breaking the stillness. They gathered fallen branches, bundling them into a growing pile between them. "Weird vibes, huh?" Jake finally said, tossing another branch onto the pile. Jared grunted. "You could say that." He paused, scanning the forest. "It's too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing." Jake nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, I don't like it." They were about to head back when a movement caught Jared's eyes. He froze, squinting through the trees. "Hey," he whispered, nudging Jake. "Over there." A young woman emerged from the shadows, her pale face framed by tangled hair. She wore a loose, dirty dress and her steps were hesitant, as if she wanted to run but couldn't. Behind her a man followed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his presence was oppressive, more predatory. His grip on the woman's arm was like a vice, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. Jared and Jake exchanged a look before stepping forward cautiously. "Morning," Jake called, his voice steady. The man's head snapped towards them, the smile widened unnaturally. "Well, look at that. Didn't expect to see anyone else out here." "Neither did we," Jared said, his tone neutral. "You two camping nearby?" The man nodded. "You could say that. Just passing through, really." The woman didn't speak. Her eyes flickered up to meet Jake's for a split second, and in that brief moment he saw something that made his stomach churn, pure, unfiltered terror. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening as he addressed her directly. The man's grip tightened and he answered for her. "She's fine. Aren't you, sweetheart?" The woman nodded, but her lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands hung at her side, trembling slightly. Then, as the man shifted his stance, she made a subtle sign with her hands, folding her thumb into her palm and then her four fingers as well. Jake's eyes narrowed. Was that a signal? Jared stepped forward, his body language calm but protective. "You sure? If you need help." "She's fine," the man snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut. His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculated glare. The woman's gaze darted between Jake and Jared. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but the man's fingers dug into her arm, silencing her. "Well," Jake said carefully, his instincts screaming at him to tread lightly, "if you need anything, we're camped not far from here." The man's smile returned, but it was a predator's grin. "Appreciate that. We'll be just fine, though." Without another word, he tugged the woman back into the trees. Jake and Jared froze for a moment, unease between them thick enough to choke. "Did you see her face?" Jake finally said, his voice low. "Yeah," Jared replied, his jaw tight. "And that hand signal? That wasn't nothing?" Jake nodded. "What do you think it means?" Jared's grip tightened on the axe. "I think she's in trouble." They didn't speak much on the way back to camp, their steps quick and deliberate. By the time they reached the clearing, their unease had solidified into a heavy, gnawing fear. "What took you so long?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I stirred the pot over the fire. Jake and Jared exchanged a glance before Jake spoke. "We ran into someone. A couple." "A couple?" Lee asked. His curiosity piqued. "Yes," Jared said, dropping the firewood with a thud. "And something's not right." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Jake explained, his voice steady but grim. By the time he finished, the fire seemed to burn colder and the shadows around us felt darker. "She did a signal with her hand," Jake said, "like she was trying to send a message." "That sure sounds like a signal," Lee murmured, his brow furrowing. "A warning, maybe, or a plea for help?" "Either way," Jared said, his expression hardening, "we can't just ignore it." I swallowed hard, the knot of dread in my stomach tightening. The wilderness had warned us once, and now it felt like it was begging us to listen. Something was very, very wrong. The hunt begins. The fire behind us crackled, but its warmth felt like a distant memory compared to the icy grip of fear clawing in my chest. My heart thundered in my ears, each beat pounding at the same unrelenting message. Danger! Danger! Jared and Jake had come back, their faces pale, their hands shaking. Whatever they'd seen had carved terror deep into them. "We can't just sit here," Jared said, his voice tight, trembling under the weight of his resolve. He was right. That man had a prisoner, and I wasn't about to let some psycho hurt her or anyone else. Jake's jaw tightened, his eyes scanned the dark forest. "We can't let him get away, not after what we saw. If he makes it to town..." His words trailed off, but the unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. I stood up, forcing my hands to steady themselves against my side, my gaze locked with Jared's. "I'm in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Jared's lips pressed into a thin line. He crossed the distance between me in 2 strides, wrapping his arms around me like he could shield me from whatever nightmare we were about to face. "The only reason you're coming is because I can't leave you here alone," he murmured, his breath warm against my hair. Then he kissed the top of my head and added, "Stay close. I mean it." Lee nodded, his face pale but grim with determination. Jake had already started prowling around the campsite, grabbing whatever he could use as a weapon. When he spoke, his voice was sharp and low. "Lee and I will lead. Jared, you keep JJ safe. Nobody splits up. No one. Got it?" We armed ourselves quickly. Torches, knives, and anything that could give us even the slightest advantage. My fingers closed around the flare gun, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. The forest swallowed us whole as we moved into its depths, Jake leading the way like the predator on a hunt. The darkness pressed in, every shadow alive with menace. My breath came short and fast. Each step felt heavier, like the earth was dragging me down. The noises were the worst. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, distant calls of animals that sounded too close for comfort. My every instinct seemed to scream at me, to turn back, but I didn't, I couldn't. My stomach churned and my skin prickled, the hairs on my neck standing on end. Jake stopped abruptly, dropping to one knee. He motioned for silence, his eyes scanning the ground. "We're on the right trail," he whispered, pointing to the disturbed dirt and broken branches ahead. "Look, drag marks." My mouth went dry. "We're getting closer," I whispered, though my voice barely worked. My pulse raced faster than ever, my body a cocktail of dread and adrenaline. We hurried on, low and silent, the oppressive silence of the forest broken only by our muffled footsteps. The trail grew more defined, the signs impossible to ignore. Then we saw it, a clearing ahead, light spilling onto the ground like a spotlight, and there he was. The man stood in the centre of the clearing, his back to us, his captive slumped against him. The girl looked teeny in his grip, her body limp like a broken doll. My fingers tightened around the flare gun, the cool metal digging into my palm. I felt a surge of nausea twist in my gut. This was it. Jake motioned for us to move in. We crept closer, each step painfully slow, every muscle in my body wound tight enough to snap. And then he turned. The man moved with an almost leisurely grace, as though he had been expecting us the whole time. His face was illuminated by the pale light. A twisted, cruel grin stretched his lips, his eyes dark and calculating, fixed on us. "Well," he drawled, his voice smooth and mocking, "looks like the little lambs have come to the slaughter." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. His smile deepened, and for a second I felt like the whole world had stopped. "Now," Jake hissed, snapping us into action. We surged forward as one, weapons raised, but the man didn't flinch. His grin widened, as if he was savouring the moment, relishing the game he'd set in motion, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just walked into a trap. Blood in the clearing. "Thought you'd come for her," the man taunted, his voice smooth and chilling, like he was enjoying this far too much. The light cut through the clearing, glinting off the knife in his hand. His grin was grotesque, slashed across his face, eyes darting between us like he was savouring the fear he could almost taste. The girl in his grip whimpered, her head lolling to the side as if she had already given up. The man's grin widened, his shoulders relaxed in mocking amusement. "You think you're heroes, don't you? Brave little campers playing saviour in the woods." Jake raised the axe he'd been carrying. "This isn't a game, and you're not walking out of here with her." I tightened my grip on the flare gun, my shoulder pressing against Jared's for support. My pulse hammered in my ears. This wasn't some movie. There was no guarantee we'd walk out of this alive. The man tilted his head, studying us. "You brought weapons? Cute. You really think you can take me?" And then he moved. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. One moment he was holding the girl, and the next he lunged at us, his knife flashing in the pale light. Lee was closest. He swung his torch like a club, but the man ducked effortlessly. The knife plunged into Lee's stomach. A horrible, wet gasp escaped Lee's lips as he staggered back, blood soaking through his shirt. "Lee," I screamed, stepping forward, but the man turned on me. I barely had time to raise the flare gun before the blade slashed across my shoulder. The searing pain made my vision blur. I stumbled back, clutching the wound, my fingers slick with blood. Jared roared in fury, lunging at the man with a knife of his own. The two clashed, the sound of steel on steel ringing out, but the killer was faster, more ruthless. He twisted, slashing Jared's arm, sending him stumbling back. Jake swung his axe, the blade missing by inches as the man darted out of reach, dragging the girl with him. "You're not ready for this," the man sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've already lost." We stood there bleeding and panting as he disappeared into the forest, the girl's terrified cries fading into the distance. "We have to go after him," Jake said, his voice sharp with urgency. "Now!" "We can't just leave Lee here," Jared snapped, his hands pressing hard against Lee's stomach to slow the bleeding. "He'll bleed out." Lee groaned, his face ashen, but his voice, though weak, was resolute. "Leave me behind." I knelt beside them, forcing myself to ignore the pain in my shoulder. "We're taking you with us," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "We're not leaving anyone out here, but we have to keep moving. She doesn't have time." Jared hesitated, his eyes darting between Lee and the direction the man had gone. Then he nodded, jaw tight with determination. "Help me get him up." Jake knelt, slinging one of Lee's arms over his shoulder while Jared took the other. Lee winced but didn't complain, his teeth clenched against the pain. "Stay close," Jared growled, his gaze locking with mine. "I mean it, JJ." I nodded, grabbing the torch Jake had dropped earlier. The weight of the flare gun in my other hand felt heavier now, as if it knew how close we were to the edge. We moved as fast as we could, stumbling through the forest. Every sound felt magnified. The crunch of the leaves underfoot, the distant cries of the girl, and somewhere deeper in the woods, a low, guttural growl that didn't belong to any human. "What was that?" Jake whispered, his voice tight. None of us answered. The trail grew fresher, the drag marks more distinct, but with every step the forest seemed darker, the air heavier. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. We pushed on, the girl's cries growing fainter and fainter, the growling growing louder. Whatever was ahead, we were walking straight into its jaws. The beast's lair. The forest seemed alive around us, every shadow twisting into something threatening. The deeper we went, the less human the world felt. The girl's cries faded into an eerie silence, but the growl, that gutted primal sound, grew louder. My pulse pounded in my ears, each step making the hairs on my neck stand on end. Lee's weight pressed heavily on Jake and Jared as they supported him. Blood still seeping from his wounds, staining their clothes and leaving a trail we couldn't afford to think about. He was pale, his breath shallow but determined. You sure? You don't want to leave me behind? Lee muttered weakly, a grim smile on his lips. Shut up, Jake snapped, though his voice cracked with worry. We're not leaving you. The growl sounded again, closer this time, reverberating through the trees. My stomach twisted as I gripped the torch tighter. What the hell is that? I whispered, though no one answered. Then we saw him, the man. He was standing in another clearing ahead, the dim forest light casting his shadows in sharp relief. He still had the girl, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood something wrong. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear or a massive dog, but then it straightened, its hunched form towering over the man. Its limbs were long, its movements jerky and unnatural. The moonlight caught its face, and I bit back a scream. It was misshaped, its features twisted as if moulded by cruel hands. Matted hair clung to its head. Its mouth hung open, revealing jagged yellow teeth. "What the hell is that?" Jake hissed, his voice barely audible. The man smirked, his hand resting almost affectionately on the creature's shoulder. "Meet my boy," he said, his voice dripping with pride. "Raised him myself out here. He's hungry." The beast let out a low growl, its eyes human but feral, locking onto us. My knees felt weak, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. "We're not afraid of you," Jared said, his voice shaking but defiant. He stepped forward, his knife trembling in his hands. The man laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, you should be." With a shove he sent the girl sprawling onto the ground, and the beast took a step towards her. "No!" I shouted, raising the flare gun. My shoulder screamed in protest, but I ignored it, aiming for the man. The flare shot out, a blinding streak of light in the darkness. It didn't hit him, but it was enough to make him and the beast recoil. "Now," Jake yelled, swinging his axe as we charged forward. The clearing erupted into chaos. Jared lunged at the man, their knives clashing as they struggled. Jake swung at the beast, but it moved with terrifying speed. Its claws raked across his chest. He cried out, stumbling back, but staying on his feet. I grabbed the torch, swinging it wildly to keep the creature at bay. Its eyes locked on me, its growls deepening as it advanced. My heart hammered as I stepped back, my mind racing for a plan. Behind me, Lee was struggling to stay upright, his face pale, but his grip on his makeshift weapon firm. "Don't let it win," he rasped. The girl scrambled away, her sobs cutting through the sounds of the fight. The man snarled in frustration, shoving Jared to the ground, and grabbed her again. "Enough," he bellowed. The beast hesitated, its head snapping towards the man as if waiting for a command. "We're not done with you," Jake growled, blood dripping from his chest. He raised the axe again, his determination unshaken. The man sneered, dragging the girl towards the forest. "Stay if you want. He'll finish you off." He nodded to the beast, then disappeared into the forest with the girl. The beast let out an enraged roar, its eyes snapping back at us. It charged, its massive form barreling towards us. "Run!" Jared shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. We didn't need to be told twice. Half dragging Lee, we stumbled back into the forest, the beast's growls echoing behind us. My lungs burned, my shoulders throbbed, but we couldn't stop. Not now. The girl's cries were gone, the man was gone, but the nightmare was far from over. Shadows of the beast. The air was heavy with tension and the metallic tang of blood as we trudged up the forest path. Lee was pale, clutching his stomach, while Jared limped from his wounds. My shoulder throbbed, but none of us said a word about stopping. The man was ahead somewhere, dragging that poor girl, and we weren't going to let him disappear into the shadows of the forest again. Jake walking slightly ahead, gripping the axe tighter, his jaw set in grim determination. Every step felt harder, the ground uneven, and littered with roots that seemed to reach out to trip us. The forest was alive with the sound of our ragged breaths and the distant growl we all dreaded to hear again. The ground shuddered beneath us, at first subtle. I thought it was just my own shaky legs, but then it came again, harder. The earth let out a low groan, as if it was alive and angry. I grabbed a tree for support, just as the quake hit full force. "Get down," I shouted, though the words felt shallow by the chaos. Trees swayed like reeds in the wind, branches snapping and falling around us. The ground split in places. Cracks zigzagging like the forest floor itself was tearing apart. I clung to the tree, my shoulders screaming in protest while the others struggled to stay upright. "JJ, over here," Jake's voice cut through the roar, and I saw him crouched low, waving us towards a slightly open patch of ground. We scrambled to join him, the tremors making every step feel like a battle. When the shaking finally subsided and eerie silence followed, my ears rang, and it took a moment to realise the distant growl was back again, louder, closer. "He's here," Jared muttered, clutching his injured arm. "That thing, it's coming." Before I could respond, the beast emerged from the tree line, its misshaped form illuminated by a shaft of light piercing through the canopy. Its eyes locked onto us, filled with a mixture of rage and pain. It looked more human now that I was seeing it up close, but something about it was undeniably wrong, twisted like a nightmare come to life. Jake didn't hesitate. With a primal yell, he charged, swinging the axe with all his might. The blade bit into the beast's shoulder, eliciting a guttural growl that made my stomach churn. The creature lashed out, swiping at Jake with claws that glinted like shards of glass. Jake stumbled back but managed to keep his footing. "Get back," I shouted. But Jake wasn't listening. He swung the axe again, but this time the beast dodged, retreating into the shadows with a strange, almost mournful howl. The forest was silent again, saved for the laboured breathing of our group. "Did we kill it?" Lee asked, his voice weak. "No," Jake said, gripping the axe tighter, "but it's hurt, not dead." We pressed on, every step heavier than the last. The quake had transformed the forest, uprooting trees and exposing parts of the earth that hadn't been seen in decades. The sight stopped us in our tracks. Bones, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The earthquake had unearthed a gruesome graveyard. Skulls grinned at us from the dirt, their empty sockets accusing, and I felt bile rise up in my throat. "What the hell?" Jared whispered, his face pale as he stared at the scene. "This is where he's been bringing them," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "This is where he's been feeding it." I didn't want to think about how many lives had ended up here, how many screams had gone unheard in this secluded hell. The air was thick with a rotten stench, and I forced myself to breathe through my mouth. "We have to keep moving," Jake said, his voice hard. "That thing's still out there, and so is he." I nodded, gripping the knife in my hand so tightly my knuckles ached. The fight wasn't over yet, but as I looked at the bones scattered around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in it way over our heads. The beast's fall. The forest was silent again after the aftermath of the quake, leaving the air heavy with dust and dread. The beast's growl echoed in my ears as we stumbled forward, our bodies battered, our spirits frayed. Every step felt like a monumental effort. The weight of Lee's limp form on Jake and Jared's shoulders dragged us all down. "We need to stop," Jake panted, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Blood soaked his shirt, but his grip on Lee never faltered. He's not doing well." Lee's head lolled to one side, his breathing shallow. His usually sharp eyes were unfocused, his lips moving soundlessly. My heart clenched as I knelt beside him, gripping his cold hand. "Lee, stay with us," I urged, my voice cracking. "We're going to get you out of here, okay? Just hold on." He blinked slowly, a ghost of a smile flickering his face. You're a terrible liar, JJ," he whispered. Before I could respond, the growl came again, closer this time. My stomach turned to ice as I turned and saw the beast emerging from the trees, its massive frame silhouetted against the pale light. Its movements were slower now, its shoulders hunched and blood seeping from the axe wound Jake had inflicted, but its eyes burning with fury. It was still coming for us. "We make our stand here," Jared said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. He handed me the flare gun, his eyes lingering on mine for a brief moment. "You stay back. If you get a clear shot, take it." "No way," I protested, but he was already moving, pulling his knife free. Jake followed, gripping the axe tightly despite his injuries. The beast lunged, its claws swiping at Jake. He dodged, swinging the axe into its side with a sickening crunch. The creature howled, rearing back, and Jared took the opportunity to slash its leg. It staggered, but didn't fall, its massive arm striking out and sending Jared tumbling to the ground. I raised the flare gun, my hands trembling as I aimed at the creature's chest. "Come on," I whispered, my fingers tightening on the trigger. The flare shot out, a burst of red light that struck the beast squarely in the chest. It roared, its matted fur catching fire as it thrashed wildly. Jake and Jared scrambled away as it stumbled back, its growls turning into painful screams. "Is it dead?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. The beast wasn't done yet. It lunged again, its flaming body a terrifying sight as it bore down on us. This time it went for Lee, its claws reaching for him. "No," I screamed, throwing myself in its path. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but the beast's movements were slower now, its strength waning. Jake and Jared were on it in an instant, their weapons striking in unison. With one final gutted growl, the beast collapsed, its massive frame hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The flames consumed it, the air filling with acid stench of burning flesh. "Lee!" Jake cried, dropping to his knees beside him, but it was too late. Lee's chest had stilled, his face serene in death. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched his hand, my body racked with sobs. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry." Jared placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "We have to keep moving, JJ. The man, he's still out there. He's got the girl." I nodded, wiping my tears away. Lee deserved more than this, but there was no time to mourn. We couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. We stood, battered and broken, but determined. The man's trail was faint but visible, leading deeper into the forest. Jared tightened his grip on his knife, his jaw set. "This ends now," he said, his voice low and resolute. With one last look at Lee's still form, we turned and followed the trail. The nightmare wasn't over, but we were ready to face it together. Will it ever end? We had to find him. No more running, no more hiding. This was it. The woods felt darker now, the trees looming like silent watchers as we made our way deeper into the forest. My heart was pounding, every breath a ragged echo of the fear that had been gnawing at me for days. The killer, he was out there, and he was not going to get away again. Suddenly, there he was, right in front of us, standing at the edge of another clearing, just beyond the shadows of the trees, his eyes locked on mine. And for a moment everything went still. "Thought you'd be back," his voice cut through the tension like a knife. It was mocking, cold, almost amusing. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. The weight of everything we'd been through, the loss of Lee, the horrors we'd seen, it had to come to an end. I raised my axe, ready to make this final strike. "We're taking her with us," I said, my voice steady, despite the fear threatening to tear me apart. The killer's grin widened. "You think you can stop me?" Without warning, he lunged. Everything happened in an instant. Jared and I moved in opposite directions, but the killer was fast. His movements were erratic, like an animal cornered, unpredictable. I swung my axe, but he ducked and spun, dodging my strike. Then Jared made his move. With a swift motion, his knife cut deep into the killer's side. The sound of it, that sickening squelch, made me sick. But there was no time to dwell on it. The killer's scream was almost primal, full of rage. But he wasn't done yet. He staggered back, clutching at the wound, and before I could react, he bolted into the trees, disappearing into the dark. "No," I yelled, taking a step forward. "We can't let him get away." But it was too late. He was gone, just like that, vanishing into the forest as if he had never been there at all. "He's gone," Jared said, his voice hollow. He was bleeding. His arm was a mess of cuts, and he didn't seem to care. He was focused on the girl now. "We need to get her out of here." I glanced at the girl. She looked lost, her eyes wide and unfocused. She was still shaking, but at least she was breathing. At least she was alive. We had saved her, but in that moment the bitter knot of guilt twisted in my chest. Lee hadn't made it, and the killer was still out there free. I didn't have time to think about it. There was no time to grieve. We had to move. 2 weeks later. The small town felt different now, quieter somehow. The police had found the remains of the hot pools, and with that the families of the victims finally had the answers they'd been searching for. The girl we had saved was with them now, safe, recovering, but none of it felt enough, not after what we'd been through. Jared and Jake stood with me outside the police station. We were all still trying to process what had happened, trying to make sense of the aftermath. It was like a fog. There was no escaping it. "You think it's over?" Jared asked, his voice low and distant. I shook my head. "No, it's not over." I couldn't shake the feeling we hadn't finished it, but that somehow he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching us. Suddenly I felt it, that cold chill that ran down my spine, the feeling of eyes on me. I turned around, scanning the streets. Nothing. Just the usual crowd of people going about their business, but I knew I had seen something, someone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Jared and Jake both turned to me confused. "See what?" Jared asked. I didn't answer. My heart was pounding, a cold sweat dripping down my back. The figure. I had seen it. It had vanished so quickly. It couldn't have been him, could it? The chill in the air deepened. I looked down at the ground, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps, and that's when I saw it. A piece of paper, lying discarded on the sidewalk. I don't know why, but I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. The note was simple, almost too simple. "I'm not done. I know where you are." The ink was smeared, as if written in a hurry, and I could feel my blood run cold. "No," I whispered, my throat dry. "No, he's not done." I turned to Jared and Jake, but they were already looking around, their faces pale. They hadn't seen him, hadn't felt the same unease that gnawed at my gut, but I knew the truth. The killer was still out there, and we hadn't seen the last of him. I shoved the note in my pocket and looked up the street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. "Get inside," I said, my voice sharp. "Now." We ran. We didn't look back, but the laughter, his voice, his laugh, echoed in my ears, ringing through my skull like a death toll. "I'm not done. I'm not done." And in that moment, I knew he was right. It wasn't over. The nightmare was just beginning.